Since President Trump's re-election, one of his top stated priorities has been to retake control of the Panama Canal. Handling almost $300 billion of cargo per year, the Panama Canal is one of the most economically and strategically important shipping routes in the world. The Panama Canal was built by the United States in the early 1900s. Ownership of the canal was transferred to the Panama government in 1999. Trump accused Panama of violating the terms of the transfer by charging excessive fees and allowing China to gain undue influence. He thus wants the United States to retake control of the canal. Loss of the canal would be economically devastating for Panama, as the canal's revenue funds almost 1/4 of the government's budget. In March of 2025, a consortium of investors led by the US company BlackRock acquired 2 ports on either side of the canal in a deal valued at $23 billion. Trump declared this as a victory, saying the United States had reclaimed the canal. Panama's president begs to differ. He says Trump is lying and Panama still has complete ownership of the canal. In this video, we'll look at the complicated history of the Panama Canal, and what the recently announced BlackRock acquisition actually means. When researching about the Panama Canal, the first place I looked was Ground News, which is also the sponsor of today's video. They're a website and app that gathers news from around the world in the entire political spectrum. You can go to ground.news/WSM or scan my QR code to track breaking news around topics like geopolitics, crypto, and many others. For example, Ground News gives over 200 headlines about the Panama Canal ports being sold to BlackRock. We can look at the political bias distribution and see that coverage of this story is slightly skewed to the right. The political bias of each publication can massively skew their framing of the story. For example, the left-leaning Le Monde says, Panama's Chinese ports pass under the flag of the United States. The word Chinese is in quotation marks, which hints that they may not even be Chinese. We'll discuss these ports in detail later. The right-leaning Western Journal says, did Trump just win over Beijing? Panama Canal ports held by Chinese entity will be transferred to US ownership. This frames the story in the broader context of US-China competition. Ground News has been an invaluable tool helping me understand the full perspective on important stories. And because it's subscription-based, you never have to view any ads. And now I'm giving my viewers 40% off this unlimited access plan, which you can get by scanning the QR code or going to ground.news/WSM. And now back to the video. The idea of building a canal connecting the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans has existed since the 1500s. The economic value of a canal is obvious. If you wanted to transport cargo between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, you would have to take the long and costly voyage around South America. A canal going through Central America would make this journey far shorter and cheaper. The most logical place to build the canal was the narrow isthmus of Panama. By the late 1800s, technology had advanced to the point where it was at least theoretically possible to build such a massive canal. At the time, Panama was controlled by the Republic of Colombia. The Republic of Colombia lacked the technical and financial resources to build the canal on its own, so they came to a deal with a French investor named Ferdinand de Lesseps. Lesseps would raise money from French investors to finance the construction of the canal. Lesseps' French company would own the canal, but would have to pay royalties to the Colombian government once it begins operations. Lesseps was able to raise massive sums of money from French investors, who expected to profit handsomely once the project was complete. Construction began in 1881, but it proved far more difficult than Lesseps had anticipated. The canal had to be built through rainforests, which contained massive amounts of mosquitoes carrying tropical diseases including malaria and yellow fever. Most of the workers came from France, as well as Caribbean islands which France had colonized. Lacking any immunity to Panama's tropical diseases, the workers suffered atrociously high mortality rates. By 1889, Lesseps' company had spent the modern-day equivalent of $10 billion, and 22,000 workers had died. But the canal was far from complete. Lesseps' company went bankrupt, and his French investors suffered a total loss. The United States, under President Theodore Roosevelt, wanted to take over the bankrupt project. In 1903, the US offered Colombia the modern-day equivalent of about $300 million, plus annual royalties, if they were allowed to finish the canal. The Colombian government rejected the proposal. They believed that this offer significantly undervalued the canal. After all, the French had already completed $10 billion worth of construction. Taking it over for just $300 million seemed like a lowball offer. In response, the United States supported a pre-existing separatist movement in Panama. In 1903, Panama declared independence from Colombia. In exchange for US support, the new Panama government gave the United States rights to build and own the canal on very favorable terms. The American construction effort was far more competent than the previous French efforts. They used insecticides and mosquito netting to reduce the risk of disease. Most of the workers were hired from various Caribbean islands. Construction was finally completed in 1914. The United States spent the modern-day equivalent of $16 billion. Including the earlier French investment, this brings the total construction costs to about $26 billion adjusted for inflation. During the American construction phase, almost 6,000 workers died from accidents and diseases. 22,000 workers died during the French construction phase, bringing the total death toll to 28,000. By the 1950s and 60s, the Panamanian government was increasingly dissatisfied with the U.S. control over the canal. The canal generated massive revenue for the U.S. Panama, which was a much poorer country, received very little economic benefit from the canal, despite it being located on their territory. When Panama declared independence in 1903, they were in a very weak position. They needed the support of the U.S. military to prevent Colombia from crushing the rebellion. The U.S. exploited the situation by demanding very favorable terms for the canal. By the 1970s, the situation was becoming untenable, and there was growing anti-imperialist sentiment within the United States itself. So in 1977, U.S. President Jimmy Carter signed a deal that would transfer ownership of the canal to the government of Panama in 1999. The only condition is that Panama must keep the canal neutral. They cannot sell ownership of the canal to any foreign country. Whenever a ship passes through the canal, they have to pay a fee of a few $100,000. The canal generates approximately $5 billion of revenue per year. Panama is a small country with a population of less than 5 million. $5 billion is a huge amount of money for them and pays for almost 1/4 of their government budget. Recently, Trump has accused Panama of violating the terms of the agreement they signed with Jimmy Carter. Trump alleged that China has gained undue influence over the canal, such that the canal is no longer neutral. The Panama Canal is controlled by the Panama Canal Authority, which is fully owned by the government of Panama. This is the entity that collects the passage fees. The alleged Chinese influence is related to 2 ports located on either end of the canal. In 1999, these ports were acquired by a Hong Kong-based conglomerate called C.K. Hutchison. The canal is of a limited size. Many cargo ships are too big to traverse it. For example, let's say a cargo ship is traveling from Asia to the east coast of the United States. It reaches the canal from the Pacific. It's too big to go through the canal itself, so it unloads the cargo onto smaller ships that are waiting at the port. The smaller ships can travel across the canal and load them onto larger ships on the Atlantic side, which take the cargo to its final destination. While these ports do not directly control access to the canal, they are nonetheless very important. Trump has good reason to fear Chinese influence over the Panama ports. The Trump administration recently announced 20% tariffs on all Chinese imports into the United States. China has vowed to retaliate with tariffs of its own. But given the lopsided nature of US-China trade, China's ability to retaliate is limited. In 2024, the US imported $440 billion worth of goods from China. China only imported $140 billion worth of goods from the United States. Because China imports so little from the United States to begin with, the impact of reciprocal tariffs will be limited. China may decide to retaliate against the United States by other means. Theoretically, they could pressure C.K. Hutchison to deny its port services to US-owned cargo ships. To be clear, China has not announced any intention to do this. It's doubtful that such a thing would even be possible. If the ports were to start discriminating against US ships, the Panama government could revoke C.K. Hutchison's rights to operate them. The prospect of C.K. Hutchison discriminating against US ships is very remote. But now that Trump is engaged in a trade war against China, he doesn't want to take any chances. In his public statements, Trump refused to rule out the use of military force to take control of the canal. This puts the Panama government in a very precarious position. As a small country, they realistically have no means to defend themselves from military action. At the same time, losing control of the canal would be economically devastating. Fortunately for Panama, it looks like Trump has found a face-saving way to declare victory without actually taking control of the canal. In early March of 2025, a consortium of investors led by the US company BlackRock agreed to acquire all of C.K. Hutchison's ports for $23 billion. Hutchison owns dozens of ports around the world, including the 2 ports on either side of the Panama Canal. This is a big win for Trump. Now China has zero influence over the Panama Canal whatsoever. It's also a win for Panama. The Panama Canal Authority still owns the canal and collects the passage fees. They don't really care whether the ports are owned by C.K. Hutchison or BlackRock. It's also a win for C.K. Hutchison. $23 billion is a fair, if not a generous price for the ports. Their share price surged more than 25% on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange after the deal was announced. While Trump's negotiating style may be unconventional, at least in this case, he was able to secure a deal that can be considered a win for all sides. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about the Panama Canal? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.